Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. My name is Emil Hkayem. I'm a Middle East analyst here at the IISS. And we're here today to discuss Syria's security sectors and its future. A year and 3 days ago, the Assad regime collapsed, and the Assad regime distinguished itself by its relatively strong security structures. There was a Syrian Arab army, which saw itself for decades as one of the three big Arab militaries, but there was also an array of security agencies that controlled the population, coup-proofed the regime, but also competed against each other. And ultimately, for a variety of reasons, including the Assad regime's inability to reform and resource its security sector, the morale within the armed forces dropped. There was no sense of what was the purpose of continuing to fight. And on the other hand, you had an array of groups that surprised a lot of us by their ability to coalesce, even if for a moment, and drive all the way down from Idlib, a tiny area in northwest Syria, all the way to Damascus. The big question today is, given Syria's strategic location at the heart of the Levant, given the externalities of the Syrian crisis in the previous 15 years in terms of terrorism, migration, and other forms of instability, is whether and how the new government in Syria can reestablish control over territory, over population, in a way that is in line with international expectations and standards. So a team at the IISS, led by Wolf Christian Pace here, and including Edward Beals, Laysa Al-Ajlouni, Leah Elements, but also a couple of external contributors, did help us, did put together a research report that was published in October 2025, looking at the prospect for security sector reform in post-Assad Syria. Wolf Christian, Leah, Lace, and Edwards are with us today. And the first part of that webinar will be me essentially asking them questions about and engaging in discussion about their findings in the report, but also since the report. And then we'll turn to the audience to take questions on our findings. So thanks again for joining everyone, and let me start with Wolf Christian, who led this effort. Wolf, we were in Damascus together a couple of months ago. Can you provide us with an overview of what the new Syrian government has done in terms of defense reform, including topics you are familiar with, SSR, DDR. I'm going to be using a lot of acronyms, but how much progress has been made, if any?
Yeah, thank you very much, Emil, and thank you for the opportunity. From my point of view, think three developments really stand out, and I mean the first thing really actually happened um, already a year ago, and that was that the Syrian Arab Army was disbanded. Right? I mean, you pointed at the fact that they put up surprisingly little resistance during the HTS-led offensive. And then immediately after the fall of Damascus, a decision was made by the new government to disband the old military, send people home. There was a partial amnesty for let's say minor offenders, But that's really it. So basically, a large number of soldiers were sent home. Nobody quite knows how many troops the Syrian Arab Army had at that time. The official number was something like 160,000. In reality, it was probably quite a few people less. Now here the challenge is, of course, that whereas many conscripts were probably happy that it was all over and the war ended, the question is, what do you do with the professional officers, the NCOs, basically the people who had made a career out of it, and which in Syria come largely from one ethnic minority group, the Alawite community. And I think we're probably going to touch upon that specific issue later on as sort of the first thing, even before the new government really started thinking about the future, it basically did away with the old. And of course, what we know from other contexts is that this is a very dangerous thing. If you send even a defeated army home without able to help them in terms of social reintegration, it contributes to grievances, right? We've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this in many other places. The second thing the new government then did is at the Victory Conference in late December last year, when Ahmed al-Sharaa was basically sworn in as the interim president, they also made a declaration saying that all the opposition forces, the anti-Assad coalition, basically would in the future serve under the umbrella of a new reformed Ministry of Defense, which of course is led by the new regime. And that's really in essence where SSR efforts, security sector reform efforts are going. The interesting question is how far along this path we are. It's not easy to say. But I mean, by all indications, no real integration has taken place, right? So yes, they all are now formally under the Ministry of Defense. It's not entirely clear whether in all cases the Ministry of Defense is actually paying salaries to them. I mean, that was one of the expectations. But I mean, the old unit structures, the chains of command are largely intact. And the third important point is not only did all the opposition groups formally at least integrate under this new umbrella, but the new government has also set out to recruit new fighters, new soldiers. So there are massive recruitment efforts underway at the moment, both for the army and for what is called the general security, which is basically a paramilitary police force under the Ministry of the Interior.
Uh, Thank you, Wolf Christian. It will be good to discuss, at a later stage, essentially the balance of power between the Defense Ministry and the Interior Ministry, where, how are resources apportioned? Where do the trusted commanders go first? Is it better for, an up and coming officer to join domestic security or the armed forces, given the considerations at play. But thanks for this overview. Um, I wanted to turn to Lace now because all this is not done in a vacuum, right? I mean, the new security structures are a continuation, perhaps an extension of what existed in Idlib, but they also need to do things differently and at scale. So I'm curious, Lace, from your own research, HES was a tight, well-structured organization, which explains why it survived those for 15 years because before emerging as victorious. But this new Syrian army, cannot be organized, or perhaps it can, you'll tell me, the same way as HES was. It needs to be large, it needs to integrate fighters from almost all walks of life. It operates with a different set of resources. It also operates under international scrutiny. But can you tell us about how the evolution of Ahmed al-Sharaa, what it tells us actually about his abilities to succeed into turning what was a highly ideological, in a way, revolutionary vanguard organization into, a broad-based organization here to serve the interests of the nation.
Thank you, Emil. Of course. If you look at the trajectory of Ahmed al-Shara, since he was a young fighter with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, until he became the current leader of Syria, I think his trajectory can be characterized by two things. First, his political adaptability and his strategic pragmatism. However, if we look at the success he made leading Idlib and leading HTS, it was because one main reason he was leading a one homogeneous a group of fighters who come from a Sunni Islamist background. They all shared the same doctrine and the same goal of toppling al-Assad regime. And that made it easier for him to govern such a group. His career as a leader of HTS and al-Nusra was centered on leading these groups. However, it might be challenging for him to lead a large country like Syria with people from several diverse cultural and religious backgrounds. These are Druze, Kurds, Christians, Muslim Alawites, Muslim Shia, even Sunnis who are secular and on a different political spectrum and school of thoughts than al-Sharaa. If we look at the current structure, and maybe Wolf touched upon it, and he can explain later, the current consolidation of the military forces is HTS centric. All commands, chains of command are controlled by HTS, and al-Sharaa so far, despite of his outreach to the several Christian, Druze, Kurd communities, and despite of all of his political messaging on diversity and so on, he failed to convince key minorities that the new security forces, the new military, is neutral. Massacres of Alawite in the Syrian coast, troubles in Al Suwaida all indicate that Syrian minorities, other groups who are not Muslim Sunnis in Syria, view the new government and the new military with skepticism.
Thank you, Liz. So it is your assessment that most of the new commanders are directly or indirectly related to HTS. Is that accurate?
Yeah, most of them are either directly related to HTS, people who served with al-Sharaa in Idlib and so on, or other organizations that were allied with HTS in other parts of Syria.
Okay, I mean, just to linger on the issue of HTS in Idlib, I mean, HTS was not alone in Idlib. It faced a variety of other actors, some to its right. There were Islamist organizations that were Haras al-Din as an example, but not only, who, remained attached to, a essentially a jihadi agenda. But there are also other groups that we'll discuss also later, who, essentially evolved from the mainstream rebellion into essentially groups supported by Turkey, the last remnants of the rebellion. How did the Shias either defeat or manage this diversity among armed groups in this very small territory of, I think, around 4 million people? What was
Okay.
the secret sauce for their success?
Yeah. So if we look at the relationship between HTS and Idlib and Ahmed al-Sharaa himself and Idlib, I think being in Idlib was some sort of a strategic choice for Ahmed al-Sharaa for several reasons. If we look even at his history when he was in the prison in Iraq, his companion Abu Umar Saraqib advised him that he should operate from Idlib. And the journey of HTS in Idlib can be looked at in two lenses. The first lens is the most important one. I think the geography of Idlib as a relatively small city in Syria compared to the other cities, its direct borders with Turkey played a role in the success of HTS in Idlib. The second part of it is that Idlib is a majority Sunni city with people who were marginalized by al-Assad regime. These two factors enabled the success of HTS and Ahmed al-Sharaa in Idlib. Now, if we look at his journey, HTS's journey in Idlib, I think it can be characterized in four main pillars. First of all, the consolidation of power, then the building of governance and economic hegemony, and then professionalization of the armed forces of HTS, and then managing international relations by HTS. So yes, there were other Islamist groups, but al-Sharaa had a combination. HTS had a combination of repressing these groups, fighting them, eliminating them, and co-opting them. HTS fought the Free Syrian Army in Idlib, the Syrian Liberation Front, and the National Liberation Front. At the same time, while fighting these groups, they offered them the chance to operate from the Syrian Salvation Government. They also made them dependent militarily and economically on HTS and allowed them some military autonomy, but also at the same time, they allowed them to operate only from the larger Fath al-Mubin operations room directed by HTS. The second pillar of success for HTS in Idlib was their ability to control the economy. They had control over the Bab al-Hawa crossing. They taxed the local economy. They had monopoly over basic services like electricity, fuel, water, and waste. All of these generated revenues for HTS to sustain itself, which was not the case for other groups in other areas. The third group is that the third pillar is that HTS worked on educating its fighters, building the doctrine of its fighters away from the doctrines that were on the space in Syria by within other Islamist groups. HTS focused its education for its recruited fighters as being national fighters, national army, rather than Islamist army that doesn't know borders. And I think that was appealing to both the national, to the local communities, and to the international community. Now, the fourth pillar, I think, is that HTS managed to work around international distrust. They were distrusted by the Turks, by the Americans, by other players in the region. However, the way they handled the borders, stopping the flow of refugees to Turkey, stopping the flow of drugs to Turkey or through Turkey, and fighting ISIS, gave al-Sharaa and HTS the sufficient credibility to be at least seen as non-enemies but non-friends and Idlib. All of these elements, I think, were essential in the success of HTS and Idlib.
Thank you, Lace. I mean, what you're describing and what other excellent analysts on Syria and HTS have described is HTS as a learning organization, that learn from the failures of other groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq or ISIS in Iraq and Syria, or the mainstream rebellion in Syria and so on. I mean, and that, is quite striking. When we were in Damascus, it was very interesting to hear that in a way HTS had created a group of people, intellectuals and others, to reflect on the lessons from all these other cases, so that they can transform their organization into something more viable, and eventually they succeeded. So thanks for this, Lace. Leah, turning to you, the largest organized force today that opposes HTS. I'm not saying that it's a high intensity conflict, but still deep political disagreements and deep mistrust is the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a Kurdish-dominated organization that has worked alongside the international coalition to defeat ISIS. And the SDF controls much of northeast Syria, but is essentially surrounded at this point by Turkey in the north and the new government's forces in the south. So in March, there was a big event. There was, an agreement between Damascus and the SDF about, next steps that was heralded as, some kind of turning point. First, was it a turning point? How is the integration process or, the unfolding, if there's any? What's happening on this front? I mean, is there any movement despite the seeming political paralysis or nothing at all?
Thanks, Emil. Yes, so as we heard already before, all sort of armed formations were sort of declared as having joined the MOD, but of course this does not apply to the Syrian Democratic Forces. And as you mentioned, they're a big force. There's sort of various estimates floating around, but estimated to be between 70 and 100,000 combatants. So yeah, very significant player that is at this moment not under the control of the transitional authorities. As you say, yes, we had that agreement on the 10th of March, where in principle the SDF had agreed to integrate its forces under the MOD, but this was very much in principle, and the implementation of that agreement has proceeded at a sort of extremely slow pace, and details around that are also quite murky. 3 days after that agreement, there was on the 13th of March, the constitutional declaration was issued, and to my understanding, that was sort of done without any consultation of the autonomous administration in the northeast, which sort of proved a bit of a stumbling block and sort of also threw that process off quite a bit. I wouldn't say that nothing is happening on that front. So we've had sort of various negotiations that have happened throughout the year between SDF leadership and the transitional authorities, with sort of international input and mediation provided by the United States and also France. So over the summer, there was, I believe, a series of meetings that took place in France that then once again stalled, the main sort of stumbling block always being, this approach of decentralization of the security forces, but also politically. And perhaps the most recent development then was in early October. There were some, I believe, small-scale clashes between the SDF and the interim authorities in some of the Kurdish neighborhoods of Aleppo. I'm not sure now exactly of the number of casualties, but I believe quite low. Nonetheless, a ceasefire was brokered, again, with help from the United States. I believe that has been violated a few times since then, for example, around the Tishreen Dam. Then around the middle of October, according to news reports, the commander-in-chief once again sort of reiterated the willingness of SDF to integrate. After, again, a series of meetings took place between SDF commanders and also US representatives, then again in mid-October between an SDF delegation and Damascus. The last that I'm aware of is that Mazloum Abdi has confirmed that integration would be occurring. I've sort of seen that they sort of said 3 new military units would be formed, as well as some individual brigades, but sort of nothing else has sort of, at least I've not seen anything since then. And I believe Turkey has, I've seen some news reports that they've sort of given a deadline of end of year for integration for the SDF. So that's a bit what's been happening on that front.
Thank you, Leah. So, first, I think the big debate in Syria and when it comes to the SDF is, of course, beyond the political framework and process is, would the SDF join as one unit with its own commanders, with its own resources, and be a localized force, so a kind of national guard in northeast Syria, or is the SDF meant to be dismantled and people joining as individuals into a new organization? And one suggests a more decentralized future for Syria. The other one suggests a more centralized future. So that's the first point, just trying to read into what you just shared. The second point is, to what extent is the SDF making those announcements to essentially please the US, which, it has invested significantly into Damascus. So the SDF cannot afford to cross the Americans just yet, but also to win time with Turkey, just make sure to, delay, any Turkish military attack as well. So, it's not clear that the SDF has committed to anything that is substantive and irreversible. But thanks for this. The other one, and it goes back to what we were discussing with Lace, is what about the other rebel factions, especially those that sat in Idlib? Also a salad bowl of acronyms, the Syrian National Army and a bunch of others. The Syrian National Army itself being an umbrella organization which had significant Turkish support, but operated as a border guard essentially. Are they being integrated as a whole, or are they, also being split, into, smaller units, or as individuals brought into the new Syrian armed forces?
Yes, sorry, I just have the phone ringing next to me. Unfortunately, there's the office telephone next to me, but hopefully it will stop ringing now. Yes, so as you mentioned, there are some other non-state armed groups where sort of an integration process is unfolding. So yes, the Syrian National Army, estimates for sort of the size of that is around 30,000 across 40 different factions. So quite a few. These are estimates, of course, and also has a sort of a very fragmented nature. Overall, on paper, the various factions have agreed to be integrated, and the SNA was, as many other groups, officially on paper dissolved. In practice, and I think this is also something that Wolf Christian has also already mentioned, divisions seem to have either been rebranded or sort of absorbed and sort of mixed with sort of some other groups, and this has also then entailed, for example, changing sort of insignia on uniforms, those sort of things. In terms of, for example, salaries, if we look at that, my understanding is that initially salaries were still being transferred directly from Turkey and Qatar to SNA combatants, while in June this year, the salaries began being sort of paid first to the transitional authorities, who then used sort of the same app that they use to pay public servants, essentially. So there was a bit of a change there. I've seen that more recently reports have indicated that especially the smaller units are maybe being absorbed into other divisions and maybe sort of mixed with other groups, whereas maybe some of the larger groups that were mainly sort of in the second corps, which I guess had sort of, from my understanding, the strongest links to Turkey, for example, the Sultan Suleiman Shah division, that they've remained more sort of intact, but have sort of been moved into other areas, so to say. And the National Liberation Front, I guess, in some ways a little bit similar, around sort of a similar estimate in terms of sizing, around 25,000. And I mean, Laith has already also mentioned them before, made up of, I guess, last estimates, maybe 20 different factions, had, sort of cooperated with HTS already before. And at the time when we wrote the report, these faction had sort of largely integrated under the MOD. They had adopted sort of new division names, and other factions had sort of been transformed into new divisions. So just as an example, sort of several of the smaller units went on to form the 44th Division. And here also you had something, I guess, maybe a little bit related to recruitment and salaries. You had some of the former members that sort of began retiring, while then also there was recruitment into those units as part of the broader integration process. What has also happened is that any sort of former fighters, so veterans, they continue to have their salaries paid by Turkey, while new recruits received salaries more from Damascus. So that is a little bit about those two groups.
Thank you, Leah. We'll come back to this in a moment. But let me turn to Edward now regarding a group of fighters that is of particular interest to the international community, and that these are the foreign fighters, the array of foreign fighters that lived in Idlib and aligned with HTS and served in a way as a shock troops for that. Obviously, the number of countries in the international community worry that these fighters may not be fully on board with the new HTS agenda, which is very much Syria-centric, but continue to have global jihadi ambitions. So can you tell us a bit first about the size of the problem? And second, can you tell us what the government has done so far to either entice them or compel them to drop their weapons, join the new security forces, or exit the fighting world altogether?
So thank you, Neil. So indeed, since 2011, tens of thousands of foreign fighters have entered the country, who are drawn by, for example, sectarian loyalties and ideological convictions. So today, foreign fighters can be broadly divided into two categories. So on one hand, we have ISIS members, who are mostly detained in prisons in northeast Syria, and on the other hand, so the focus here, we have the allies of the new government. Of these allies, at least 5,000, so likely many more, remain in the country. Most are Uyghurs, including the roughly 3,500 associated with the Syrian branch of the Turkestan Islamic Party, the TIP. So most are based in northwest Syria, as you said, so particularly in Idlib, as well as in urban areas, including Damascus and Homs. So foreign fighters has been actually one of the most contentious issues, complicating rapprochement between the Syrian government and Western states, as well as the integration of the SDF. So on one hand, many have married Syrians, they've started families, and they plan to stay. And they're unable to return home due to having had maybe their citizenship stripped, or fear of imprisonment or death. On the other hand, their presence has at times fueled sectarian violence, including the March 2025 killings of 1,400 Alawites in Latakia and Tartus. Their presence could alienate Syrians, particularly ethnic minorities. So now briefly, I wouldn't argue that the Syrian government has tried to entice or compel them to drop their weapons. So the HTS has long tolerated and at times used foreign fighters, allying itself with, for example, the TIP, even though after 2020 it did shift towards sidelining and dismantling rival jihadist factions. However, in terms of committing the foreign fighters to the government's vision, Bashar has sought to integrate them into Syria's defense apparatus. So in December 2024, 6 of the 49 new military appointees were Jordanian, Turkish or Uyghur foreign nationals, assuming the senior rank of colonel or brigadier general. In addition, a new 84th Division, so nicknamed the Foreign Fighters Division, has also been established. According to some sources, it's projected to go up to 30,000 fighters, although this would then mean that many more foreign fighters in the country than other figures suggest. Fighters are to be based in Latakia Governorate and deployed to northwestern Syria, so far away from the centre of control and near coastal areas where Assad loyalists previously had their strongholds. On a final note of particular interest is that candidates to be part of this division will still have to complete a formal vetting and rehabilitation process. They'll have to renounce all previous organisational affiliations and also agree to comply fully with Syrian military law. So thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you. Has there been any evidence that the issue of foreign fighters has been linked to the political discussions in New York or elsewhere about lifting of sanctions, designations, and so on. I mean, you mentioned the Uyghurs, the TIP. Has China, for instance, conditioned, any move at the Security Council on specific steps or commitments by Damascus? You're on mute, Edward.
I'm very sorry. So I can't answer specifically in relation to sanctions, but I could maybe give you a little bit of an overview in how different countries have reacted to the issue. So the US was initially very opposed to the integration of foreign fighters. So for example, Trump urged al-Sharaa to tell all, quote, foreign terrorists to leave Syria on the 14th of May. So of course very vague language. Yet Washington then quietly agreed to selective integration by June 2025. You also mentioned China. So China, together with Russia, is very concerned that experienced fighters, so including those from the Caucasus and Xinjiang, would gain training and legitimacy. And this might, in their eyes, increase the risk of terrorist attacks. So, for example, reminiscent of ISIS-K in Krasnogorsk in March 2024. So in response, these countries might escalate diplomatic pressure on Syria, they might intensify intelligence operations abroad. And last month, actually, China and Syria agreed, they signed an agreement to deepen collaboration in security and terrorism.
Thank you, Edward. Is it your sense that the primary engagement by those international actors is through the lens of counterterrorism, and how forward has Damascus been, in that? I mean, we hear news of deepening relationship with the US. Can you tell us to what extent CT is the main, the main theme of discussion?
So indeed, one very important development, which sort of is situated within this wider CT theme, has been Syria's decision to join the US-led global coalition to defeat ISIS, with a political cooperation declaration announced exactly 1 month ago on the 11th of December. Syria is now listed as a partner on the official website, and it's seen as a member according to the US Department of State's website. As some brief background to the coalition, it was established in 2014 and has contributed to the elimination of ISIS's territorial caliphate in 2019. Prior to Syria officially joining, there was already coordination between the Syrian government and the coalition, including in at least 5 instances. And in more sort of broader terms, there has been general intelligence sharing, there's been collaboration on the Al-Hol camp. For example, there was a joint mechanism to remove Syrian families from the camp established at a meeting on the 25th of May. And the establishment of military communication channels. And this very much contrasts the Assad regime's attitude, which saw the coalition as very much impeding on Syria's sovereignty. And of course, we know that in recent years, Sharaa also had extensive experience fighting ISIS under HTS, and formerly the Nusra Front, and cooperating with the US. So membership in the coalition, it does present opportunities for the Syrian government. So politically, Syria can gain international legitimacy as a partner in the regional war on terror. And of course, this would be particularly beneficial given the government's history. Militarily, it can gain operational and technical support from the US and coalition partners, taking part in joint military operations. Strategically, it can maybe balance itself against the SDF, which has been the coalition's cooperative partner in Syria, so potentially increasing its leverage in negotiations, which have been taking place this year. And finally, in terms of intelligence, it can gain access to coalition information sharing systems. For example, vetting new recruits, such as the foreign fighters I mentioned, who are being incorporated into the 84th Division. So very much political, military, strategic and intelligence related benefits. If I may also just add on a final note, that there have been obstacles to the Syrian government joining the coalition, which will still persist. So firstly, the Syrian Ministry of Defense is in the formative stage of its institutional development, and this in turn undermines trust. The MOD has limited capacity to conduct proper background checks, and it's weak in terms of its military capabilities. Secondly, the Syrian government, of course, has tensions with the SDF, which already cooperates with the coalition. And finally, of course, there's the chance that intelligence could leak to extremist factions within Syria. And, of course, many still view the Syrian government, including its foreign fighters, with suspicion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. Returning to you, Wolf Christian, you have served in a number of similar contexts, and you have a good understanding of how international partners invest or not in these kind of situations. So, from your perspective, how much international support, and when I say international, I also include regional support, has Syria received for security reform so far? Have governments really invested in that, or have they, been skeptical or unwilling or whatever?
Yeah, thank you, Emil. That's a really interesting question. I mean, what is striking about Syria is that most of the world seems to be really welcoming the new government, right? And I mean, that's sort of surprising. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, Iran, Israel to some extent, but the rest of the world seems to be quite happy about the transition. Now, security sector transformation is, of course, a massive challenge. It's going to be a very long process. We're talking about years, possibly a decade or more, and it's going to be extremely expensive. I mean, as I was trying to say at the outset, if you want to do this right, it requires a massive investment in terms of resources, both know-how and cash. Now, some actors, of course, have done that. I mean, the Turkish government remains engaged, right? I mean, they've been providing salaries, might still be providing salaries indirectly to some groups. There are some joint training efforts. Jordan has been engaging in some joint training efforts. There's talk about other players getting involved as well. But the main challenge here really is that all of these approaches are piecemeal, right? So you do a little bit of training here, you provide a little bit of salaries there. There's some talk about military equipment being procured from outside that could also be seen as part of the security sector transformation. But what is really lacking is a coordinated effort. And one of the reasons we don't have a coordinated effort is that there isn't really a coherent strategy, at least none that we're aware of, right? The new government has made a couple of statements regarding some key policy points, but the detail is lacking. So, there is no action plan for security sector reform, at least not that we've seen it, we've heard about it. And on the other side, on the side of the international community, normally 1 year into a transition of this sort, you would have somebody who coordinates efforts on the ground for the international community. That would traditionally be the United Nations in a lot of environments, could also be the European Union, could be the US, could be really anyone, but you would need a sort of a key donor or a key partner to do this. And that is also lacking. The United Nations, for historical reasons, is not in a good place in Syria at the current time, and is in general in crisis, of course, as we all know. And Western donors in particular have been very reluctant to engage, despite welcoming the new government in general. And regional partners in the Gulf have been more willing to put resources forward, but so far at least have been lacking in terms of strategic leadership. So of course we don't know what's going on behind the scenes, right? But I mean, there is no indication that there is a master plan quite yet. And without a master plan, of course, it's very hard to provide international support because, well, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? So, I mean, the partners who are not very keen to engage in the first place are saying, well, dear new government, give us a strategy and then we can pick and choose what elements we want to support. Do we want to support police reform? Do we want to invest into infrastructure? Or, what is it going to be? And on the other hand, the new rulers, in my opinion, at the moment lack the capacity to really develop a detailed strategy because I don't have the experience to engage on the scale. That brings me back to an earlier question that you had raised, Emil. I mean, when we're in Damascus, what came up all the time is basically that the new government is following the Idlib model of administration, right? And we've heard this, you and I, being said, well, we managed to rule Idlib quite successfully. So why wouldn't we be able to do this on the greater scale? That's of course correct, and the new government has made quite a number of important achievements. At the same time, Idlib is a pocket, a rural backwater in a sense. Now you need to run a much more complex country, and so in a sense, precisely because we don't have a strategy, we don't have enough international support, and we're not going to get a strategy without international support, and that is very dangerous. Because of one dimension that we haven't really discussed during this webinar so far, and that is the time dimension, right? I mean, international experience shows that after a transition of this sort, you have a time window where you have the opportunity to make effective change because people are happy that the old regime is gone and they're willing to embrace new ideas. In our report, I think we call it the honeymoon period. And once that time window closes, it gets a lot harder to make these changes, and we risk to basically lose that time window because, well, we're 1 year in, and so much remains to be done.
So in previous, perhaps more hopeful times, the 90s and 2000 and 2010s, the international community did invest in security reform. It structured itself around, UN resolutions. They were either a lead nation or a multilateral groups that came. There was information sharing and so on. That doesn't necessarily mean that the result was great, but there was an effort, perhaps wrong, misguided effort, perhaps not well resourced, perhaps too oblivious to local politics and so on. I mean, we saw the case in Iraq, for instance, where the Iraqi security forces collapsed in the north in 2014, even though on paper they were much stronger than ISIS, yet ISIS won in Mosul and then went on a genocidal rampage. So just because it was done differently at a larger scale before doesn't mean that it was necessarily successful. But the question I have for you is, when you look at previous cases, and I'm asking you to make parallels, not analogies. What is the case that looks to you the closest, or the cases that looks the closest to the Syrian one? I'm just curious. We all think through comparisons and analogies at times. What resonates for you? Which other case, could have some lessons for Syria, positives or negative?
Well, I mean, as you rightfully say, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and indeed, the international experience, including in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when there were more resources and more focus on this, wasn't exactly an easy ride, or there are more failures than successes even there. I think two things stand out for me. I mean, one point we've already touched upon on that, and that is the risk of basically sending a defeated army home without building some sort of pathway, right? I mean, we've learned this in Iraq, we've learned this elsewhere. If you do this, you're guaranteed to have to deal with grievances. So I mean, if we were to make a recommendation to the new government, and of course we at IISS are always very reluctant to do so, it would probably be to study cases where this has been done, right, where you send a defeated army home, and the alternative basically then is, of course, to have some sort of reintegration support. I mean, to basically see that people have livelihoods to go back to and help them creating these livelihoods. This is called a reintegration program for former fighters. This is certainly necessary for some elements of the Syrian Arab Army. And as we said before, the particular challenge here is that so many of them are then coming from a singular sectarian group, which has their own grievances, not just their military man, but as a community regarding their role in the new Syria. The other point is that forced integration of the type that the government is trying to do. So basically, where, as Leah says, in a sense, you rehead them, right? I mean, you maintain unit structures, you maintain chains of command, you keep the units more or less in the same area of operations where they've always been. You just say you're now whatever, the first brigade of the new Syrian army has its own challenges. And here we've seen this in a lot of countries. If you do this, the moment you have new political tensions, a fallout between political leaders, it's then comparatively easy to take a group back into the field, right? Because the unit structures are still intact and the chains of command are still intact. I mean, I saw this firsthand in South Sudan, where I spent a couple of years during the CPA process. Now, of course, South Sudan is very far from Syria and very different, but structurally the challenges are somewhat similar, right? So they also had various militia groups which were formally integrated, but not really. And then the moment two political leaders had a disagreement about who would make the better president, one side took 40% of the military back into the field and back into another round of civil war. So, I mean, to me, that remains sort of the biggest challenge, right? How does the new Syrian army manage to really get into real integration going? And a final point on that would be we've seen elsewhere that possibly the best case scenario would be that not only the forces of the old regime, the Assad army, is being reintegrated, but also probably elements of the rebel forces should be integrated, because the new Syria, of course, needs a professional army and a non-sectarian army. The new Syria doesn't have unlimited financial resources, and military force is very expensive. So what Syria would need, in my view, is actually a demobilization of both groups, or well, of both sides, and the creation of something new at the same time. And that's, of course, a very, very difficult and challenging process, not least because you have the question, how do you fill the security vacuum that emerges if you demobilize fighters on one side without having the new forces already in place?
Yeah, thanks for this. I mean, I suspect you'll agree with me that much will depend on whether the new government sees the security forces as the key pillar of the new Syria, coming from that legacy, whether, their authority and control derives primarily from, pure coercive power, or whether there are other institutions to build alongside the armed forces and the security forces at large. So this is a real state building effort. It's not just security reform. Reform is part of a larger case. But just because you mentioned best case scenarios, and let's pretend we are optimistic, hopeful people for a second. What are good examples of successful demobilization of fighters who then return to civilian life and so on? Given the examples we have from a number of places in West Africa, Middle East, and Balkans and elsewhere. What do you think has worked well? There are many reasons for why that would have happened, but what is which case would you point at as having been well designed and returned enough benefits in terms of stability?
As you mentioned, the Balkans, I mean, it went reasonably well in Kosovo, I would say, after the sort of Kosovo War of Independence. There, most of the fighters of the UÇK, the Kosovo Liberation Army, were demobilized. Some of them joined in something basically like a civil defense corps, like a fire brigade, disaster relief force. Ultimately, some of them took political roles. In fact, some of the commanders became the president of Kosovo. But that's a different question, right? But they did manage to a lot of them left the military life behind. Now, the reason this was possible, of course, was that Kosovo at that time was an international protectorate, and that brings us back to this earlier point I was trying to make, that if you want to have a large-scale demobilization effort, somebody needs to provide security while you're doing this. And the somebody in the case of Kosovo was NATO, right? And in West Africa, say Liberia, where there was also a reasonably successful process after the end of the Civil War, it was the United Nations, a strong United Nations force, which did this. So, I mean, there are examples. There are also examples, of course, from Western societies, right? I mean, so Germany, where I'm based, demobilized the whole army after German reunification, which was a touchy process at the time, right? A sophisticated, ideologically driven East German military force. And to me, the two success factors is one, security, right? So, you must avoid the situation where a security vacuum emerges. Then there needs to be a plan for that. And the other thing is resources, right? This is a very costly process regardless of how you do it, how you implement it, how much international aid you require. It will cost a lot of money. And it requires one additional thing, and that's legitimacy. So basically, the population needs to buy into this process. That brings me back to your earlier point, Emil, about what the vision of the new government is, what kind of military force they have. And I think, in a sense, Damascus is at a crossroad at this moment, has been at a crossroad ever for a year now since the revolution. On that is, you can either go and build a national army that is secular in nature, non-sectarian in nature, where all population groups are adequately represented and which serves the nation as opposed to a specific group, or you can go down the way that the Assad regime went, and basically create a military force that is both an instrument of repression and a system of patronage, where you give jobs to your loyalists, to people from your own group, people that you want to buy off to ensure their loyalty. And that is the situation in which Damascus finds itself, and the jury is still out which way it will turn.
Thank you. Thanks for this. I invite the members of the audience to ask their questions in the Q&A, the boxes at the bottom of your screen. But we have one question that's directed to you, Lace. It's about really, HTS in Idlib. Did HTS, develop and deepen its role in Idlib intentionally, or is it because, it operated nationally at one point? Jabhat al-Nusra did operate in and around Damascus at one point, and they had, operations elsewhere, in and around Aleppo, for instance, and so on. But do you think that was intentional? Did Idlib provide a specific environment? Was it strategic? Was it because a consequence of their own setbacks? And what's out of necessity, and what was made out of pragmatism, essentially?
Yeah, thank you, Emil. Great question. So, as you mentioned, we can't look at HTS in isolation of al-Nusra. To understand HTS, we have to understand al-Nusra and al-Nusra's journey in Syria. So if you look at al-Nusra, when al-Nusra was established in Syria, it started with small cells across Syria. These were in Damascus, Dar'a, Hama, and Idlib. The largest victory in the early days of al-Nusra was al-Nusra taking control of al-Raqqa and then operating in the broader north of Syria. Those are Raqqa, Aleppo, and some parts of Idlib. However, we have to take that into combination with al-Sharaa consideration of the strategic importance of Idlib. So when the fighting started with either the regime, other Islamic factions, and most importantly with ISIS, al-Nusra made sure that it doesn't lose Idlib and keep control of Idlib. And then they retreated. They lost al-Raqqa, they lost Aleppo, big parts of Aleppo, and maintained control of Idlib. And that's where they continued building HTS and coordinating operations across Syria. One more point that we should consider as well. We remember in 2015, 2016, the green buses era, where fighters used to be sent to Idlib. And I think that was also favorable to the success of HTS and was favorable for HTS to al-Nusra at that stage to recruit fighters and organize them within its organizational structures. So I would say it's a combination of al-Sharaa understanding of the strategic importance of Idlib and battleground dynamics.
Very good. Thank you for this. Then there's another question that relates to the geopolitics in and around Syria. I mean, undeniably, the collapse of the Assad regime has had an impact on the regional balance of power. But that new leadership, has to manage the conflicting interests of key players, Turkey, the Gulf states. I mean, it has to, or from its perspective, it has to contain or push back on Iran and Israel to some extent. So what's the strategy that the Damascus has adopted to neutralize Iran, deal with Russia, which still has a military presence, though significantly a smaller one, not be completely in the pocket of Turkey. I mean, how does Damascus, establish its credibility and sovereignty? I think, Wolf Christian, given that we were in Damascus, what are the insights you gleaned there?
Well, I mean, I think that's really the big question here. I mean, as we're saying in the report, Syria, of course, remains a hostage to its geography, like all countries are. But I mean, Syria is in a particularly challenging place, being surrounded by countries who have their own sort of designs in some cases and concerns about Syria. I mean, Turkey, at least for the time being, is a big winner here. I mean, that's certainly how it's being perceived in Ankara, and I think how it's being perceived in much of the rest of the world. The role of Iran is much diminished, as you say. I mean, there are no diplomatic relationships at all at the moment between the new regime and the government in Tehran. But at the same time, certainly there is a certain degree of influence with the remnants of the old regime, as they're called in Syria. And I mean, there are some indications that money and possibly weapons continue to find their way to some of these groups. There's certainly a lot of sort of social media spin, anti-HTS, anti-al-Sharaa spin. That sounds like it may originate in Tehran. The Gulf. And I think the good thing about the Gulf is that the Gulf is largely supportive, as we were saying before. But at the same time, some countries are more engaged than others, and none of them is really that key partner, right? That we've mentioned before, that you need somebody to sort of appoint itself as the key partner here, as the lead donor to do this. So they've all been saying, well, we provide a little bit of assistance here, we provide humanitarian assistance. There's a great hope for private sector investment, and of course there is already quite a bit of private sector investment flowing into the new Syria from the Gulf and from elsewhere. But the challenge remains. Where Syria will fall in all of this. And I mean, that maybe brings us actually back to the question of security sector reform, right? I mean, one issue here is, of course, how much of a new security force can Syria afford financially, right? I mean, because it's being a poor country. Another one is, what will the region allow it to have? And here, of course, we're looking specifically at Israel, which remains extremely concerned about the new governments to the north, and which has been repeatedly been bombing military positions in the post-Assad area, partially with an attempt to deny HTS and its allies to seize military equipment left behind by the old regime. So I think this is really, the big question behind the question, right? The question we're discussing here, security sector reform, which is already a massive challenge. And then the bigger question, if you want to zoom out, is the regional and geopolitics of Syria, where it remains to some extent a playing field for regional powers who are interested in projecting power one way and the other. And the final thought on this is, of course, and you've mentioned this before, the whole sort of Turkey Kurdish dynamic, right? I mean, one of the reasons why the SDF is reluctant to be more closely aligned with the new government is, of course, that the new government itself is pushing for more integration driven by Turkish demands, right? I mean, we met Turkish representatives who were very clear in their expectation that, there would be no independent Kurdish forces in Syria, and that you need a strong centralized state in a sense, as opposed to sort of decentralized political authority.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I, just looking at the questions, we have a few more minutes, so we'll cover that. There's a question about how Russia is positioning itself. I mean, Ahmed al-Sharaa essentially lived in a cave or a series of apartments for a decade because he was on the receiving end of Russia's bombs. And then in mid-October, he took a plane and to Moscow and met with Vladimir Putin. How is Russia positioning itself in this new period? What are Russia's strategic interests? I think that goes to you, Wolf Christian, as well. I'll contribute some thoughts, but it's linked to the big picture you just drew. How does the new Syria both satisfy and push back on those players who are important at the global level? Because, well, the new Syria wants sanctions removed, designations removed. It means that it needs all the votes it can get at the UN. It also needs to be integrated regionally, so it needs to make sure that there's no spoilers, right? So, how are they navigating these treacherous waters?
Well, I think Russia is a really interesting case. I mean, Emil, you're absolutely correct that, of course, HTS and Ahmed al-Sharaa have been at the receiving end of Russian-backed airstrikes for a decade, and yet he was in Moscow. But what we should not forget is he also has been in US detention for a decade before that, and he has been welcomed in the White House. And I mean, it looks like almost he has a bromance with Donald Trump. So, I mean, what that tells me is two things. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, Ahmed al-Sharaa is a person, but the new regime more broadly is quite willing to, let's say, let bygones be bygones, right? To focus on the future. I'm sure he and his people have forgotten neither experience, but it doesn't drive their policy, right? They're enormously pragmatic, which I don't think we expected, at least as a larger community when he came into power. What role does Russia continue to play, or what is their strategy? Well, that's not so clear. Again, I mean, unlike Iran, which remains an enemy of the new regime, Russia has been reaching out. I mean, that's why he was in Moscow, of course. There are negotiations about the continued use of bases and port facilities in Syria for the Russian forces. Russia requires a warm water port on the Mediterranean, and it requires airport access in order to resupply its interest in Central Africa, right? But for range reasons, you need to land somewhere in a friendly place if you have a military plane. Syria is important in this regard. On the other hand, I think the new government in Damascus is looking to procure weapons specifically from Moscow. So this is obviously not exactly a love marriage, but I mean it's a marriage of convenience, or it's at least the willingness to look forwards and explore areas of mutual interest. Let's put it this way. But I don't think it speaks to any deeper love on the side of the new regime for Moscow or vice versa.
Yeah, I suspect another reason for al-Shara's willingness to engage with Moscow is to make sure that Moscow restrains the Assad regime, the officials who made it there, and make sure that they are not plotting and mobilizing and sending money through. Based on recent reporting, it looks like the Russians are allowing for some of that, but not necessarily are complicit in it. But from Shara's perspective, how to neutralize the Assad security and military commanders who have made it to Moscow is quite important. One final question, and perhaps I'll ask it to Edward. It's about the resurgence of ISIS, in central and eastern Syria. Obviously, groups like ISIS thrive in security vacuums, and that transition, did create some security vacuums. It's not as apocalyptic as people would have feared it would be, to be honest, despite the very significant killings in on the coast and in the Druze in Sweden. Yes, the country is facing a level of instability, but it's not yet this apocalyptic situation. But certainly ISIS is watching, probably waiting to get to find those opportunities. So what can you tell us about the possible revival of ISIS? And do you think that the Damascus government is first aware of the threat, and second, can really count on the counter-ISIS coalition to defend it?
Yes, so if we briefly go back, so at ISIS's 2014 peak, the group ruled over 12 million people across 100,000 square kilometers. Its rule was characterized by fear, by mass killings, by by genocide, by forced displacement. Now it's very much more of a mobile insurgent force. However, there is indeed good reason to view it as a rising threat. So in recent months, there has been a notable surge in ISIS activity in some regions. So indeed in central and eastern Syria, including in the Syrian desert. The UN estimates that there are up to 3,000 ISIS fighters active in Syria and Iraq. They're mostly located in the Syria desert and the Jazeera regions, as well as populated areas near Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and the southern regions. And this number could rise. So there are reports of ISIS-affiliated individuals moving towards Syria, including ISIS-K. Also relevant are the detained fighters. So there are approximately 10,000 ISIS fighters in at least 26 facilities in northern Syria, alongside 30,000 individuals linked to ISIS at the Al-Hul and Rosh camps. Particularly pertinent issues here are indoctrination and training in detention camps. There are also attacks on prisons. So, for example, in March this year, 70 detainees linked to ISIS and an al-Qaeda affiliate escaped from one single prison. And clashes with the SDF are, of course, an issue which have further undermined security and destabilized this part of the country. After the fall of Assad, ISIS also exploited the rapid departure of regime forces So yes, pointing to this security vacuum that you mentioned, Emil, so raiding weapon stores in the Syrian desert, as well as Russian military bases. So taking these factors together, I would indeed agree that ISIS is certainly one to watch. And yeah, to the second aspect of the question, I think I would look back to the earlier points on Syria joining the US-led global coalition against ISIS. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. I think we can bring this webinar to an end now. We spent an hour and 15 minutes. There's plenty for you to look at in the report. There's a lot of other ISS work that is relevant. For instance, Les mentioned how HTS established economic control over Idlib. There's a chapter on HTS's economic strategy in the newly launched issue of the Armed Conflict Survey, which is an ISS flagship publication that a number of people on this call have contributed to. There, other work on Syria and security reform on our website and so on. On this, I want to thank my colleagues for the good work they put in for this report and for their contribution to this webinar. And thank you for the audience for joining in the hope that all this will contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous Syria. The objective of the ISS is to inform a discussion so that good outcomes can come from good policy. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye bye.